It was a quiet night, the kind where the streets seemed to breathe with an eerie calm. But that stillness was about to be shattered. Lee Brown had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift with the NYPD. Exhausted and running on fumes, she made a quick stop at the corner store to grab a bottle of water, something to ease the fatigue that had started to crawl under her skin. But little did she know, this simple errand would spiral into a situation that would shake her to her core. Lee, a seasoned officer, had always prided herself on being a bridge between the police force and the community. Her years of experience had taught her to stand tall, to do what was right, even when it was hard. But that night, standing in that parking lot, that very foundation was about to crack in a way she couldn't have predicted. She walked up to the squad car, the fluorescent lights of the store buzzing overhead. She saw a white officer, Officer Carter, harassing a group of young black teenagers. The scene was unsettling, but Lee did what any good officer would do. She stepped in. As she approached the officer, still clutching her unopened water bottle, she asked with authority, "Officer, is everything okay here?" The response she got was nothing short of shocking. Officer Carter spun around, his eyes sizing her up in a way that made Lee's stomach tighten. He didn't see a fellow officer, a senior officer with years of service. No, to him, Lee was just another black woman in a hoodie, a target, someone to be looked down upon. Without warning, Officer Carter slammed Lee against the patrol car, pinning her arms behind her back. The metal of the car pressed painfully to her cheek as he twisted her arm, ignoring her protests. The worst part. She wasn't just any person being arrested. She was asterisk one of them asterisk. An officer, someone who had dedicated her life to protecting and serving. And yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. In that moment, Lee could feel the weight of everything crushing down on her. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. She had spent years working to break down the walls between the community and the police. Now she was caught in the crossfire, experiencing firsthand the very thing she had fought against for so long. As she looked through the patrol car window, she saw the teenagers, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief, their hands trembling as they recorded every moment. They were scared, yes, but they were also determined to capture the truth of what was happening right before their eyes. For them, it wasn't just another arrest. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. The ride to the precinct was like a surreal dream. Every streetlight that flashed by seemed to mock her, reminding her of the countless times she had driven suspects to this very place. But this time, the partition between the front and back seats felt like a chasm, a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Lee caught a glimpse of Officer Carter's face in the rearview mirror. He was uneasy, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he muttered something about a miscommunication, as if his actions could be explained away so easily. When they arrived at the precinct, the desk surgeon's face told the story before he even spoke. The recognition in his eyes was clear, and for a brief moment, it looked like Officer Carter might back off. But no, his pride wouldn't let him admit the truth. Instead, he doubled down, trying to save face. The late-night cleaning crews stopped what they were doing, watching in silence, unsure of what to make of the scene unfolding before them. By morning, the video had gone viral. The incident that had started in a dimly lit parking lot was now being shared across the internet, sparking outrage, debate, and a nationwide conversation about police bias. Lee's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Everyone had an opinion. But for her, this wasn't about public opinion. It was about something much bigger. The next day, the tension in the precinct was palpable. Lee's fellow officers, the ones she had worked alongside for years, now looked at her with a mix of pity, uncertainty, and fear. Some of them knew what had happened was wrong, but others, those who were blind to the reality of racial bias, wondered why she was making such a big deal out of it. Her partner, Tom, tried to play the role of mediator, telling her to let it slide for the good of the department. But Lee wasn't having it. For the first time in her career, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught. Was it worth it? Was it worth turning her back on the very thing she had sworn to protect, just to keep the peace. No, it wasn't. Lee made the decision to speak out. She wasn't going to let this incident slide under the rug like so many others. She was going to ensure that Officer Carter faced the consequences of his actions. The thought of internal affairs investigating him was the only thing that kept her grounded in those chaotic moments. But there was something even more powerful driving her now, something that went beyond the badge. It was a sense of justice, a desire to challenge the system that allowed prejudice to be swept under the rug for far too long. As the days passed, the divide within the precinct grew. Some officers supported Lee, knowing that what happened to her wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about something much deeper. But there were others, those who didn't want to rock the boat, those who believed that Lee was just causing unnecessary trouble. But Lee wasn't backing down, not this time. As the media circus grew, with news vans camped outside the precinct, it became clear that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a moment in time, a chance to change the conversation about race, bias, and the police force. And Lee was right in the middle of it, a woman who had been on both sides of the law, now forced to stand up for what was right. What happened next would take Lee on a journey she never could have anticipated. Would she be able to turn this humiliation into something that would spark real change? Or would the forces of the status quo win, sweeping her experience under the rug like so many before hers? The story isn't over yet. The truth is just beginning to unfold, and the shockwaves of that night are only starting to reverberate across the nation. The precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy, like a kettle ready to boil over. Officers walked past Lee with hurried steps, their eyes either avoiding hers or lingering just long enough to show their unease. It was as if her presence had turned the air heavy, thick with unspoken words and buried truths. She could feel the weight of their whispers pressing against her back, but she refused to look away. If they were going to judge her for standing up, so be it. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to demand accountability. Lee had always believed in the power of the badge. It was a symbol of justice, of order, of protection for those who needed it most. She put on her uniform every day with pride, knowing she could make a difference in the lives of others. But now, that same badge felt like a double-edged sword. It had opened doors for her, but it had also blinded her to the harsh reality others faced, until that night in the parking lot. It wasn't the first time she'd witnessed something questionable. Over the years, she'd seen small moments that made her stomach churn. Offhand comments, biased assumptions, moments of unchecked aggression that were quickly swept under the rug. But she always told herself it wasn't her place to speak up. She was just one person in a system too big to change. Yet, the irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years asking the community to trust the police, to give them the benefit of the doubt. And now, when it was her turn to trust the system, it had failed her spectacularly. As she sat at her desk, flipping through files she wasn't really reading, her phone buzzed again. Another notification, another comment, another flood of messages from people she didn't know, but who suddenly had opinions about her life. She put the phone down and sighed. The viral video had thrown her into the spotlight, and with it came both support and criticism. Strangers called her brave, a hero even, while others accused her of betraying her fellow officers. But none of them knew the full story. None of them knew what it felt like to have your identity reduced to the color of your skin, even by someone who wore the same uniform as you. Lee's mind drifted back to that night. She could still feel the cold metal of the patrol car against her cheek, the rough grip of Officer Carter's hand on her arm. She remembered his voice, low and sharp, accusing her of resisting arrest when she'd done nothing but ask a question. And she remembered the teenagers, their phones held up like shields, capturing every second of the encounter. She hadn't had the chance to thank them, but she silently hoped they knew how much their actions meant. The video they recorded had sparked a firestorm, but it was also a lifeline. Without it, her word would have been pitted against Carter's, and she knew how that story would end. Even now, with the footage out there for the world to see, Carter hadn't shown any real remorse. He'd muttered something about a misunderstanding, but his eyes had betrayed him. He hadn't seen a colleague that night. He'd seen a threat. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor snapped Lee out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Tom standing in front of her desk, his expression somewhere between concern and frustration. "Lee," he said quietly, "can we talk?" She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Tom leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I get it. What happened to you was wrong. No one's disputing that. But you need to think about the bigger picture here. The department's already under a microscope, and this is just adding fuel to the fire." Leah folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "So what? I'm supposed to let it go? Pretend it didn't happen." "I'm saying," Tom replied, his voice measured, "maybe there's a way to handle this without dragging everyone through the mud. You've got a career to think about." "We all do." Lee's jaw tightened. "You think this is about my career?" "Tom, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated like I was that night. If I don't speak up, what kind of message does that send?" Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Lee. This fight, it's going to get ugly. And not everyone's going to be on your side." "I know that," she said softly. "But if I don't fight, who will?" Tom didn't have an answer. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly as he stood up. "Just be careful, okay?" After he left, Lee sat back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window. The city stretched out before her, its lights flickering like a heartbeat. Somewhere out there, people were watching the video, forming their own opinions, debating what it meant. For Lee, it wasn't just a story. It was her reality. The precinct felt different now, colder somehow. Conversations stopped when she walked into a room. People she'd once considered friends now avoided her, their smiles replaced with guarded expressions. Even Captain Reynolds, who usually greeted her with a joke or a pat on the back, seemed distant. But Lee wasn't alone. She'd received messages from other officers, some from her precinct, others from across the country. They thanked her for speaking out. They shared their own stories of bias and discrimination, stories that mirrored hers in ways that were both comforting and heartbreaking. It was a reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them. The investigation into Officer Carter was moving forward, but not without resistance. Internal affairs had been brought in, and the questions they asked made it clear they weren't just looking at Carter. They were looking at the entire department. The tension in the precinct was palpable, and Lee knew that her decision to speak up had placed a target on her back. Still, she didn't regret it. She couldn't. Not when she thought about the teenagers in the parking lot, their faces etched with fear and determination. Not when she remembered the countless stories she'd heard from people who had experienced the same kind of prejudice she had. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that needed to change, a culture that needed to be held accountable. Lee knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, attempts to discredit her, to paint her as a problem. But she also knew that change never came without a fight. And she was ready for it, no matter what it took. As she closed her eyes that night, the image of the parking lot lingered in her mind. The flickering lights, the neon sign, the teenagers with their phones. It was a moment she would never forget, a moment that had set everything in motion. What came next was uncertain, but Lee was determined to see it through. For herself, for her community, for everyone who'd ever been told to stay silent. The morning after the confrontation, Lee woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone. News outlets had picked up the story, amplifying the video's reach, and her name was now trending across social media. She hesitated before scrolling through the comments. Most were supportive, with people applauding her bravery and calling for systemic change. But others were harsher, accusing her of being disloyal to her badge, of stirring up trouble for personal gain. The duality was exhausting, but Lee knew she couldn't afford to let the noise distract her. The precinct was unusually quiet when she arrived. Officers moved with purpose, their conversations hushed, their glances darting toward her as she passed. Lee ignored them, walking straight to her desk and setting down her bag. She opened her laptop and began reviewing case files, determined to focus on her work despite the storm brewing around her. But the calm didn't last long. Brown, a voice called out sharply. She looked up to see Captain Reynolds standing in the doorway of his office, his expression unreadable. In here. Now. Leah stood, smoothing her uniform before following him inside. He closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment before speaking. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've created? He asked, his tone low but firm. Captain, Lee began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I'm not saying Carter wasn't in the wrong, Reynolds continued, pacing the small office. But you've turned this into a media circus. Do you think that's going to help anyone? Do you think the department can function with every move under a microscope? Leah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. With all due respect, Captain, the department should already be under a microscope. What happened in that parking lot wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem. And if we don't address it now, when will we? Reynolds stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't always win fights, Brown. Sometimes they just make you a bigger target. Leah didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. Reynolds waved her off, signaling that the conversation was over. As she walked out of his office, she felt a mix of frustration and resolve. She wasn't naive enough to think change would come easily, but she hadn't expected this much resistance from within her own ranks. Later that day, as she was filing reports, Tom appeared at her desk again. He didn't sit this time, just leaned against the edge, his arms crossed. Internal Affairs wants to talk to you, he said quietly. Lee nodded, unsurprised. When? Now, he replied, his tone heavy with warning. Be careful, Lee. They're not just looking at Carter anymore. They're looking at all of us. The walk to the conference room, where the Internal Affairs officers were waiting, felt longer than it should have. When she entered, 3 people were seated at the table, their expressions neutral, but their eyes sharp. They introduced themselves, their voices polite but professional, and motioned for her to take a seat. The questioning started slowly, with basic details about the night of the incident, but it didn't take long for the tone to shift. They began probing into her past cases, her relationships with other officers, her opinions on departmental policies. It was clear they weren't just investigating Carter, they were investigating her, looking for any cracks they could exploit. Lee answered their questions calmly, refusing to let their tactics rattle her. But when one of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, leaned forward and asked, Do you think your actions have undermined trust in the department? She couldn't hold back. I think trust was already broken, she said firmly. And if my actions make people question the system, then maybe it's a system that needs to be questioned. The man's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, and when it was finally over, Lee walked out feeling both drained and defiant. As the days went on, the tension in the precinct only grew. Carter had been placed on desk duty pending the outcome of the investigation, but his presence still loomed large. He walked the halls with a forced air of confidence, his eyes darting toward Lee whenever they crossed paths. She ignored him, focusing instead on her work and the growing mountain of messages he was receiving from the public. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a woman named Angela, who introduced herself as the mother of one of the teenagers in the video. She thanked Lee for stepping in that night, saying her son had been terrified but inspired by her courage. Angela's words brought tears to Lee's eyes, reminding her why she was fighting this battle in the first place. But not everyone was on her side. One afternoon, as she was leaving the precinct, she found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. The words were scrawled in messy handwriting. Watch your back. Lee felt a chill run down her spine as she looked around the parking lot, but it was empty. She crumpled the note and threw it in the nearest trash can, a resolve hardening. If they thought intimidation would make her back down, they didn't know her at all. The conflict wasn't just external. Lee found herself questioning her own beliefs, grappling with the realization that the system she dedicated her life to was deeply flawed. She thought about the people she'd arrested over the years, wondering how many of them had faced the same prejudices she'd encountered. It was a sobering thought, one that kept her awake at night. As the investigation continued, Lee's world felt increasingly divided. On one side were those who supported her, who saw her actions as a necessary step toward change. On the other were those who viewed her as a traitor, someone who had betrayed the thin blue line. And in the middle was Lee, trying to navigate a path that felt both treacherous and unavoidable. The tension came to a head during a department-wide meeting. Captain Reynolds stood at the front of the room, addressing the team about the ongoing investigation and the media attention it had brought. But when Lee's name was mentioned, the room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others dismissive. Lee stood, her voice cutting through the noise. "If anyone has something to say to me, say it now," she challenged, her eyes scanning the room. The murmurs stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Then Carter spoke, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We all know what this is really about. You wanted your 15 minutes of fame, and you got it." Lee met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't about fame, Carter. This is about accountability, something you clearly don't understand." The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was done. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. Lee left the meeting feeling both empowered and exhausted. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. For the teenagers in the parking lot, for Angela and her son, for everyone who believed in a world where justice was truly blind. The days stretched into weeks, and the investigation into Carter. And now, by extension, the department showed no signs of wrapping up. Lee felt the pressure mounting from every direction. Her fellow officers were divided into factions, and the air in the precinct had grown thick with unspoken animosities. Every glance felt weighted, every casual conversation laced with suspicion. She had become the center of a storm she wasn't entirely sure she could withstand. The support from the public kept her going. Messages poured in daily, some from strangers sharing their own stories of injustice, others from colleagues in law enforcement who commended her bravery. Yet, with every word of encouragement, there were just as many attacks, each one aimed at silencing her. Online trolls dissected her every move, while anonymous notes of threats continued to appear, tucked in her locker, under her car wiper, or even slipped through her apartment door. Lee didn't show it, but the weight of it all was starting to wear her down. One evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the soft glow of her laptop illuminating the darkened room. She scrolled through the latest updates on the case, her heart sinking as she read an article speculating that the department might push to frame her actions as a violation of protocol. The implications were clear. They were preparing to sacrifice her to shield the department's reputation. A knock at the door startled her. Lee's hand instinctively went to her phone, ready to dial for help if needed. She peered through the peephole and saw Tom standing there, a bottle of cheap whiskey in one hand and a folder in the other. "Thought you could use this," he said as she opened the door. Lee let him in without a word, her emotions too raw for pleasantries. He set the bottle down on the counter and handed her the folder. "This is everything I could find on Carter. His record, complaints filed against him, even stuff Internal Affairs conveniently left out. I don't know how much it'll help, but it's all I've got." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. There were several documented incidents where Carter had been accused of using excessive force or making racially charged remarks. Each case had been quietly dismissed, the complainants likely too intimidated or disillusioned to push further. "This could be what breaks the case wide open," Lee said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one toward her. "I hope so," he said, "but you need to be careful. If they find out you're digging like this—" "I know," she interrupted, "but what choice do I have? If we let this go, it'll just keep happening. Someone has to hold him accountable." Tom nodded, though his expression was heavy with doubt. "Just don't let them make you the scapegoat. You've already got enough enemies in the department." Lee spent the next few nights poring over the documents, cross-referencing them with her own knowledge of departmental procedures. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture of a system designed to protect its own, regardless of the cost. She knew she was getting closer to the truth, but she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. Her suspicions were confirmed when she noticed a car following her on her way home one night. It stayed at a careful distance, turning down side streets whenever she did. Her pulse quickened as she realized she wasn't imagining it. Someone was watching her. Lee didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to a nearby gas station, parking in a well-lit area and pretending to pump gas while discreetly watching the car. When it didn't stop, she felt a small surge of relief, but the unease lingered. Whoever it was, they wanted her to know she was being watched. The next day, she reported the incident to Captain Reynolds, but his reaction was predictably dismissive. "You're making enemies, Brown," he said with a shrug. "People don't like it when you rock the boat." Leah clenched her fists, struggling to keep her frustration in check. "I'm not rocking the boat, Captain. I'm trying to stop it from sinking." He waved her off, clearly uninterested in entertaining her concerns. Lee left his office with a renewed sense of determination. If the department wasn't going to protect her, she'd have to protect herself. The tension reached a boiling point during a departmental meeting. Lee had been called to present her findings on a community outreach program she'd spearheaded, but the room was hostile from the moment she walked in. Carter sat near the back, his smug expression daring her to falter. As Lee spoke, outlining the program's success and the positive feedback from the community, she could feel the undercurrent of resentment. When she finished, Carter stood, clapping slowly. "Great speech, Brown," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But maybe you should focus on doing your job instead of trying to be a hero." The room fell silent, all eyes on Lee. She met Carter's gaze, her jaw tightening. "Doing my job means standing up for what's right," she said, her voice steady, "even if it makes people like you uncomfortable." The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Captain Reynolds eventually stepped in, dismissing the meeting and sending everyone back to their posts. But the damage was done. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. Lee returned to her desk, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and fear. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The truth was too important. That night, as she reviewed the files Tom had given her, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small note in one of the reports hinted at a larger cover-up, involving not just Carter, but several high-ranking officers. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about one racist cop. It was about an entire system built to protect people like him. Leah stared at the papers in front of her, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the next step would determine everything. Lee sat frozen, staring at the note in the report. The implication was undeniable. Carter wasn't acting alone. His unchecked behavior and the repeated dismissal of complaints weren't just oversights or accidents. They were deliberate choices, part of a larger web of protection that extended far beyond him. The thought made her stomach churn. She had always known the department had its flaws, but this was something else entirely. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was Tom, his voice urgent on the other end. "Lee, we need to talk. Now, it's about Carter." They met at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes and familiar faces. Tom looked more on edge than she'd ever seen him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his coffee cup. "There's more to this than we realized," he began, leaning in close. "Carter isn't just some rogue cop with a bad attitude. He's part of something bigger, a network of officers covering for each other. They call it the Shield. It's been going on for years." Lee's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "And you're just telling me this now?" "I didn't know the full extent until recently," Tom admitted. "I overheard a conversation in the locker room. They were talking about you, Lee. They know you're digging, and they're not happy about it. They're trying to figure out how to shut you down." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced around the diner, suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. What else did you hear? Tom hesitated, his eyes darting to the table as if he were afraid to say it out loud. They're planning something, Lee. I don't know what, but they want to make an example out of you. If you keep pushing, it's going to get dangerous. Lee leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. The stakes had just gotten higher. This wasn't just about Carter or even the department's reputation anymore. It was about her safety and possibly her life. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when she was so close to exposing the truth. If they think they can scare me into silence, they're wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, okay? You're walking a fine line. Lee nodded, though she knew there was no way to truly prepare for what was coming. As she left the diner and drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every car that lingered too long behind her, every shadow that moved in the corner of her eye. It all felt like a threat. When she arrived home, she double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, her paranoia growing with each passing minute. She sat at her kitchen table, the documents spread out in front of her like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The note about the cover-up was the key, but she needed more proof, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or swept under the rug. That's when she remembered the security cameras at the precinct. If Carter and his allies had been meeting or discussing their plans, there was a chance the cameras had captured something. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. The next day, Lee arrived at the precinct early, her heart pounding as she made her way to the department. She had to be careful. If anyone suspected what she was doing, it could all be over. She greeted the technician with a smile, making small talk as she casually mentioned needing footage from a specific date and time. The technician raised an eyebrow but didn't ask too many questions. Within minutes, Lee had a flash drive containing the footage. She thanked him and quickly left, her pulse racing as she tucked the drive into her pocket. Back at her desk, she plugged the drive into her laptop and began scrolling through the footage. At first, it was nothing, just officers coming and going, chatting in the hallways, but then she saw it. Carter and two other officers standing in a corner, their voices muffled, but their body language tense. Lee leaned closer, trying to make out what they were saying. She couldn't hear the words, but their gestures were telling. One of them pointed toward her desk, his expression angry. Another nodded, his lips curling into a smirk. It was clear they were discussing her, and whatever they were planning wasn't good. She copied the footage onto her personal laptop, her hands trembling. This was the proof she needed. But as she sat there, staring at the screen, a realization hit her. If they found out she had this, they wouldn't just try to discredit her. They'd come after her with everything they had. The door to the precinct suddenly opened, and Carter walked in, his eyes scanning the room. Lee quickly closed her laptop, her heart pounding as he approached. He stopped at her desk, his usual smug expression replaced by something more sinister. "Morning, Brown," he said, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "Heard you've been busy lately. Hope you're not getting into any trouble." Lee met his gaze, refusing to let him see her fear. "Just doing my job, Carter. You should try it sometime." He smirked, leaning in closer. "Careful, Brown. You never know who's watching." As he walked away, Lee's hands clenched into fists. The tension in the room was suffocating, but she couldn't afford to let it distract her. She had the evidence she needed to expose him, and a system protecting him. But now, more than ever, she had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. Lee's chest felt tight as she replayed the footage on her personal laptop that evening. Each gesture, each sneer, and every pointed glance toward her desk told a story of looming danger. This wasn't just about her. It was about every officer who had ever tried to challenge the status quo and been silenced. But she wasn't going to let that happen, not this time. She uploaded the footage to an encrypted drive, then forwarded it to a trusted journalist she knew from her community work. just in case something happens to me, she wrote in the email, her fingers trembling as she hit send. The weight of what she had done settled heavily on her chest, but she didn't regret it. The next day, Lee walked into the precinct with her head held high. She could feel the tension in the air, the stares that followed her every move. Carter and his allies were watching, waiting for her to slip up, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Midway through her shift, Captain Reynolds called her into his office. His expression was unreadable as he gestured for her to sit. "We need to talk, Brown," he said, closing the door behind him. Lee braced herself, her pulse quickening. "What's this about, Captain?" Reynolds sighed, leaning forward. "I've been hearing things, rumors about you digging where you don't belong. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're stirring up?" She met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not stirring up trouble. I'm exposing the truth. If that makes people uncomfortable, maybe they should take a closer look at themselves." His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the door burst open. It was Tom, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Lee, you need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. The video she had sent to the journalist had gone public. It was all over the news, the footage of Carter and his allies plotting their next move playing a loop. Social media was ablaze with outrage, the hashtags calling for justice trending nationwide. Reynolds' face turned red as he grabbed his own phone, quickly dialing a number. "Get me the commissioner," he barked, his voice tight with panic. Leah stood, her heart pounding. She had expected backlash, but she hadn't anticipated the speed at which the story would spread. Outside the office, the precinct was in chaos. Officers huddled in groups, whispering urgently. Some glanced at her with respect, others with thinly veiled hostility. Carter stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. "This is a setup," he shouted, pointing a finger at Lee. "She's trying to destroy my career." Reynolds held up a hand to silence him. "Enough, Carter. We have bigger problems right now." But Carter wasn't listening. He turned to Lee, his voice low and menacing. "You think you've won. This isn't over." Lee didn't flinch. "No, Carter. It is over. You just don't realize it yet." As internal affairs arrived to take Carter and his allies into custody, Lee felt a surge of relief. The corrupt officers were finally being held accountable. But even as they were led away in handcuffs, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. Her suspicions were confirmed later that night when she received an anonymous message. It was a grainy video showing Carter in an interrogation room. He was smiling, his voice calm as he spoke. "You think I'm the only one. You're just scratching the surface. This goes all the way to the top." Leah stared at the screen, her blood running cold. The battle she had fought was just the beginning. There was a bigger conspiracy at play, one that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about her department and herself. As she closed her laptop, Lee realized she wasn't afraid. The truth was out, and she was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for a system that truly served everyone. And she wasn't going to back down.